Okay, it should be recording now.
Okay, cool. So today I'm going to talk a little bit about materials, UV editing and textures, and then bringing your models into Unity with these materials and textures. So at this point, whenever you are starting to add materials, you should pretty much be done modeling and you should be finished with retopologizing. I threw together some models last night for us to kind of practice with UVs and adding materials. So you'll see I have this kind of weird birdhouse. I have this weird plant with a face that I plan on rigging and animating. And then I have this table with a cloth, and I actually created this. I think I didn't go over this last time. One thing I wanted to show you that you might be interested in, trying to remember where it is. It's in effects. If you create a plane and you make sure it has a lot of topology, a lot of divisions, you can do something where you create a cloth and a passive collider. I'm not going to do it right now. I might do it on the animation thing, but just so you know where this is a great way to create things like tablecloths and things that bend around, and you can actually change the materiality. So you can say something is something like canvas, or you could say something's more like silk, and it'll change how it reacts with different colliders. This one was actually honey. I really like the honey one because it's very strange. So just so you know, that's all in effects up here at in cloth. And so today I'm going to stay with modeling when I'm adding some materials, but at some point we will go into the UV editor, and I might actually come over here into rendering. And so to first create materials, there's a couple of things. Not all materials so actually this is what I'm going to talk about right now. Not all materials will transfer to Unity. And so I need to keep this in mind. So you'll notice that Maya comes with Arnold, and not everything using Arnold and the Arnold renderer will work in Unity. I believe if you're using HDRP with Unity, those materials will work, but if you're just using classic Unity, try to stay away from Arnold if you're not familiar with it. And so if we want to create just basic colors, we can click our model, and I'll just start with this one. I'm going to right click, come down here, and do assign new material. And when I do that, this little window is going to pop up. You'll see there's a bunch of different materials. Again, there are these Arnold shaders down here. I would stay away from these unless you're using the HD pipeline. Later on today, I'll talk a bit about ambient occlusion and how you can render that. That's a little bit more advanced. But the ones I want you to focus on are under here, Maya surface. And so there's a couple, let's see, that I wrote down that you can look at. The main one is going to be Lambert.
Kylie, Shannon just asked in chat, will these effects transfer to Unity? So I just thought I'd interrupt to ask that question.
Yeah, so if you're talking about the materials, I'll go over which materials work best. For effects for the end cloth, you can use end cloth to create different models, but what you're going to have to do is delete the history so it's just one model. You won't get the animation of end cloth across. The only animations that come across are blend shapes and rigged models. So anything that's doing kind of the special effects, that's not going to come across. Yep. So give me 1 second. I need to move a couple of these over. And so you'll notice right now that all of these are gray, and this has Lambert 1, which is the typical material that is placed on an object. And so when I created that material, you'll see I have Lambert 2 here. And here I can change the color. I can change the transparency. There's a bunch of different effects. I'm not going to go through every single one. Kind of just want to play with them. But besides just moving these, you can also click these little checker box and you can create these render nodes. And so if you've worked in node editing before, you'll see it, in Substance Designer, for example. I think Nuke does node editing. I will show you where to access the nodes. But just so you know, if you want to add something like a file or a different type of effect, you can add it here. If you use something like a ramp or one of these other ones, you will have to render that out from Maya into a file texture because these will not work on their own in Unity. So just keep that in mind. You'll only want to either use colors or your own file. You can use something like a ramp, but we will have to render it out. And so one thing I want to also bring up is that when you're creating different materials, you need to change the name of them. If you're on a team with multiple artists, I can guarantee that each of you have a Lambert 2, a Lambert 3, a Lambert 4. When you bring those models and materials across into Unity, it will create issues if each of you don't have unique names on the materials. So be sure to change the name. So I usually put, my initials and some sort of description. So again, we can select an object, right click, and I can assign a new material. I can also go down to existing material, and you'll see I have one listed right here. And so the ones from the Maya surface that you can use in Unity are Lambert, Phong, Blend, and then Stingray PBS. We'll go over that in a minute. Stingray PBS is used if you are using a PBR, so physically based texture. I have a couple, give me a second, that I saved. So something, let's see, like this, where you've got all of these different textures. This is a physically based. And you can make your own, you can find them online also. Again, if you're using something like Substance Designer, they usually render all of these different things out. So that's a preview of it. And so if you have something like this, where you're trying to add a material, you'll want to use Stingray PBS. So again, I can assign new material. Let's just do a different one. So these have a different kind of shine to them. And I'll just add a different color. One thing to also note is that you can change things, oops, give me a second, by face. It doesn't just have to be by object. And so this is a really simple way to, use a color palette. Let's say you have a limited color palette and you're trying to optimize your game. Something that's really great is that you can actually bring in this model and these materials into Unity and use the same material on multiple objects. It's really good for, a stylistic look. But if we're wanting to add more detail besides color, we will have to UV edit. And this is one of those things that people don't ever want to do unless you like puzzles or something like that. But it is required whenever you're doing something like a hand-drawn texture. And so I think the easiest thing to start with actually is a plane. And so we're going to come up here. We're going to go to UV editing. And so you'll notice that I have this, and then I've got this window right here. I'm going to move the chat window really quick. Give me a second. I've got this window here for my UV editor, and then I have my UV toolkit right here. And so UVs essentially are how we project a 2D texture or a 2D image onto a 3D object. And so the simplest way to describe that is how you might, wrap a present, or the classic example is how they would take the strips to create a globe and paste those onto a globe. So the two things that you need to keep in mind when you're creating UVs, the goal is to have the fewest amount of seams. And so this is a seam right here with the least amount of stretching. And so when we look at an object, we're trying to figure out how we will wrap this with the fewest amount of pieces or seams without a distortion. And so when we are in this UV editor, if you come up here to UV and modeling, there's a couple of different ways that we can start our UV editing by projecting. And so we tend to look at things based on the shape that they are. And so a planar projection is going to be pretty easy. This one will probably do a cylindrical. So we're just looking at the basic shapes. This one we might do a square, where we have different pieces. And then this is a little bit more organic. And so we might cut it a couple of different ways. So we just need to keep that in mind when we are UV editing. So let's just start with a plane. I probably won't actually do that much with the UVs because they look pretty good, because we're looking at this checker and we're trying to see if there's any distortion or any weird spots where the checkers come across. And with a plane, you don't typically have to do much. And so if we just come up here to UV and planar, you'll notice when I clicked that the checkers became very weird. And you can see it's because it's actually projecting perpendicular to it. And so we need to rotate the projection. So one thing you can do is come over here to the attribute editor, and you'll see polyplanar project. And I need to change this rotation. So I just changed that to 0. And you can actually grab these little pieces here, which are also changing things over here. So I'm going to show you something. When we are doing UVs, it needs to be in the 0 to 1 space. If you look at typical texture maps, you'll notice they're always square and they have little pieces put into this one square. I often get asked why that is. I'm not sure why. It's just how 3D works. But we want to make sure when we are in this UV editor that we don't have a bunch of different things popping up like this. And so you can grab UVs, or you can grab a UV shell, which is the whole piece. And so you'll see it's making all of this pop up because I'm right on the edge. So if I hit R, I can actually just scale down in this area. So I realized I didn't have that on. You want to turn on the grid so you can see this 0 to 1 space. And so we want to fit everything into this space. And so again, if I pull this out, it'll open up these different pieces. But I'm just going to pull it in a little bit closer. And so this is pretty simple because it's just a plane. Let's try attaching some sort of image to it. So I'm going to assign a new material. I'm going to do Lambert. I'm going to name this leaf. I might actually go out of the UV editing for a second. So it'll turn that off. I'm going to go to material attributes. I'll see that it says leaf. Go over here, we'll select file. And then I'll look for my texture. Got this leaf. And then it's not showing up right here. What you need to do is just click this to show textures. So you'll see this is just something that I drew in Photoshop and brought in. Remember last time I was talking a little bit about planes and how they don't necessarily project across. So if you wanted this to have the same look on the other side, what you would actually do is duplicate this plane, move it just a little bit, come up here to the normals. You can reverse it. Might even try to get it closer. And then we could do where is that tool? The target weld tool. Where we go across. For some reason it's not letting me grab it. Might need to combine the two of them, but where we create this into one model, I'm just going to combine them for right now so I don't spend all my time doing that. Just group them. And so there, I'm going to center my pivot. You'll notice because I grouped it that it moved the pivot. So that's a really easy way to do something versus, 3D modeling something. And it's really great for something like plants where I can start to duplicate and I won't have as many polys. So if I hold D and pull down, I can change the pivot point. And I could start to, add these where these planes are. I want to make sure I'm grabbing the group instead of the individual piece. But typically you'd want this as one model. So you can start to do things like this. And you could add a deformer after you've done this and start to bend them. And you could also do this to create blend shapes, which we'll go over next time, to add some animation, maybe like a little bit of wind or something like that. And so that one's pretty simple because it is a plane. And so again, if I just click into that and into the attribute editor, you'll see if I go to leaf. Right now I have this color and transparency because it's taking the transparency from my PNG. If I click that little button over here, I've got my leaf. I could reload it. Let's say I wanted to change part of the drawing, but I also have this place 2D texture. And so in this, I could actually start to change the way something is projected. And you can change how much something repeats. So that one's pretty simple. Let's do this one. Let's try to do this one. So if I'm looking at this, I know when I modeled this that I started with a plane. So what I will probably do is try to project again a plane onto this. So I'm going to go into my UV editing tool. I'm going to select this. I come up here to UV and let's do planar. And you'll notice it's not projecting the way I want to project down. So I'm going to come over here and do, actually, that was not the way I needed to go. There we go. And so you can see that that looks better, but there's some major stretching right here. So just looking at this, it's actually not too bad, but there is some pretty bad stretching here. Again, I could drag this around. You'll notice when I'm dragging, it's changing it in this window. I am going to keep this in one piece. I'll do one in a second where I do it into a couple different pieces. But I'm going to right click and select UV shell. I'm going to come over here to my UV toolkit. And so remember, I'm going to scale this down a little bit because it's not in that 0 to 1 space. And so you'll notice if I were to just scale this down really small, because let's say I wanted to put all of my texture or my UVs into one material and put them all here, I lose the amount of resolution in this 0 to 1 space. And so the goal is to have it as close to the edge as possible based on the number of pieces that you have so that you can get more detail. This is also known as textile density, which I'll go over in a second. So with this, again, I have this UV shell selected. One thing we can do is turn this on and it shows you different areas where it's stretching. So if you see any kind of red or blue, that means that it is stretching. So we see that red a little bit right there. So I'm going to select this, and there's a bunch of different tools in here. I'm not going to go over all of them. First one I'm going to do though is try to unfold this. And sometimes I click it a couple times. I'm going to turn that off and move this down. So you'll notice that really helped clicking unfold. So it's just basically kind of optimizing and unfolding it. And it doesn't have that stretch anymore. I can also continue to hit optimize a little bit, a couple times. And that's starting to look better. And so, you know, I could rotate it. It looks okay right now. What I might do when I add something is rotate the texture itself. But you can imagine that I could then export this UV out to Photoshop. It'll give you the outline and you could paint on it and update it here. But let's just add a texture to it. So going back to general, going to assign a new material. Let's do Stingray PBS. I'm going to do this feather, this weird feather texture that I found online. So let's do this PBS to show you this material. So I'm going to name this feather texture. And if you have files that you're attaching for these, if you're using these maps right here under textures, you need to make sure that you check them. If you don't check them, it will not use them. So I'm just come over here. I will access that file. So give me a couple of minutes to connect these. Trying to remember which ones I actually have. Let's just do those for now. I don't think I have any of the other ones. So I'm going to turn off the roughness. So you'll see I have this material now, but it's too big for me. I want it to be smaller. And so what I will do, just as an example, I can come in here. Trying to remember where. There it is, polyplanar project. You know, I could start to change things here. It's kind of hard to see because I have it selected, but I'm actually impacting it right here. And if I open my UV editor, oh, I might have messed up those UVs. Hopefully I didn't. Yeah, I accidentally clicked something and messed them up. There we go. You can actually come down here and click this, and you can see it here. And so I could grab the shell, and I could scale it way up or scale it down, rotate it so that it's facing the angle that I want. So that's an easy, quick way to, again, add a texture and do a planar projection. I'm going to save right now because one thing to remember is when you're UV editing, Maya likes to crash. So please, every time that you spend a lot of time UV editing something, be sure that you save. Also, you probably will want to save multiple versions, so save a copy. So we've gone over, let's see, Lambert, Blend, Stingray. So let's do another UV that's not a plane, and then I'll show you a couple of other things. So let's do this. And we'll do cylindrical. So I'm going to go into my UV editor and turn on my checker box. And this one is actually pretty good because I used the loft curve. And so I didn't do a lot of editing. Let me pick a different one. That one's actually done pretty well. Let's do this one. This one's got some stretching here. Okay, so this one was created using a cube and some deformers. And so you can see that it's actually pretty good going across. There's a couple pieces that if we were to add a texture to it would start to stretch. So if you'll see here that in this UV editor, if I go to UV shell, it's all one piece. If you look really closely, you can see where the seams are. It's that little white border. I can't move my mouse over it because you'll start to see it. But actually, if I go to edge and select something like an edge, you can start to see that is a seam right there. And so you'll always have seams. But what I could do for this is think about how this birdhouse might be constructed. And so maybe it's, 4 pieces of wood that have a strong division right on the corners. And so there are definitely good and bad ways to UV, but there's not necessarily right or wrong. It really depends on what you plan to do with your textures. And so one thing that I could do is take those pieces, go to my UV toolkit, and select cut. You'll notice that is now a white border. Got a white border there. Got one here that looks a little strange. So what I might do is cut here and sew here. So I'm sewing pieces back together, and you'll notice when you sew that sometimes things go really wonky. So watch when I click sew. I'm sewing across, so I probably wouldn't want to do that. But you can create different pieces. Let me do a cut right here. So let's see. Now I've got a couple of different pieces. So you'll see I have a UV shell here. I have a UV shell here. And then I have one here. And so that one actually looks okay. So I'm gonna pull it over here. One thing that you can do is if you have multiple of something and they're the exact same, you can stack shells on top of each other, but they have to be exact. But let's try to unfold this. So you'll see it's kind of a weird unfold. I'd probably want to do some other cuts, but it did help with this piece up here. So actually one thing I might do is create another cut around the bottom because I don't plan on people seeing the bottom of this. Oh, I accidentally unclicked it, but and then I should be able to grab the shell. So I've got a couple of different pieces. You'll notice I have this weird piece right here, so I'd probably redo that and sew these back together. It's a little bit of a cumbersome process, so I'm not going to go all into that. So you'll see it's doing this weird thing right here. But you'll see that you can start to create these different UVs, and that actually, see, you can see that seam right there where the one is. And there's something up here that I'd probably want to edit a bit further, but it's underneath this roof, so it's okay. So you'll notice when I click off, you don't see it anymore. But I've got these different pieces. I do need to make sure that I scale this down because it's going into that 0 to 1 space. So one thing I also want to show you is, let's say I have, move this over, and then I've got this piece. And so you'll notice that these checkers are smaller than these around. And this will impact if you're using something like a pattern or a texture because of the amount of repeating for the texture. And so if you want them to be the same resolution, that's called textile density. And so you can come over, I'm trying to remember where it is. Okay, so it's under transform. And if you scroll down, you'll see this textile density. And so even though I would like for all of it to get this amount of resolution, I can kind of look at this and tell that there's no way I'm going to be able to fit all those pieces in. And so what I might do is actually change this one to match the textile density of this piece. And so if I click that and hit get, it retrieves the textile density. So that's how many pixels per unit. I can then select another UV shell and say set, and it'll put it at the right. So just so you can see the difference, when I set it, it now matches the textile density of these. So then I could, add some sort of texture, some wood texture, something like that to this. One thing actually I'm going to also show you is how to, so this one, for example, I know that I will keep this on top, so I don't really worry about the UVs in here. I might want to, so if you click this, you can isolate something and those UVs look okay, but this looks pretty bad. But if I know I'm going to see the bottom of this, I would create some cuts right around the legs and unfold, probably do one cut down and unfold each of those. I'd probably do this piece as one. And then maybe another piece, which is this ring, and then I would unfold that. But for now, let's just add the birdhouse material to this because I want to show you how to export with the textures. So again, I'm going to save. And I have my group selected here. I'm going to go to File, Export Selection. And I'm selecting FBX Export. When you have materials, especially something with a file texture, you want to make sure that you have embed media checked. This will keep the materials, and it usually, sometimes it still loses it, but usually keeps track of your file textures. So if I go to Maya, let's just do table. And then let's bring it into Unity. So to import into Unity, you can just right click, select import new asset, go find it. And when you are importing this, you'll notice there are these import settings that pop up. You want to click extract textures. This folder in Unity is fine. I'm going to have to fix the normal map and extract materials. If you don't do this, it will not bring in materials and you won't be able to change them within Unity. So you need to make sure that you're extracting textures and materials. So I'm going to scale it way up because I accidentally made it in centimeters. And you'll see that I've got both of those. Again, this was a plane, and so it is invisible looking through it. So again, I would probably go back, duplicate this, scale it down just a little bit, pull it down, and weld the vertices. But you'll see that I now have these different materials that I can now change in here based on my own lighting. Because when you bring stuff into Unity, it's not going to look the same as this viewport. This viewport is using its own default lighting, which is not the same as Unity. So don't think that something that is in here is going to transfer 100% over. Honestly, the best way to look at it is to do a software render. That's not working because I don't have the texture on there, but that's really the best way to test versus the viewport. So I can actually go to this birdhouse and I can change it in here based on my own lighting. You know, I can change metallic or smoothness. You can add these different maps. And you'll notice it's already connected all of these files, which I can then change here. One thing to also keep in mind is this is set for opaque. If you're doing something that has an alpha transparency, such as the leaf, you actually don't want to do transparent, you want to do cutout. And then you use this alpha cutoff. Transparent will have this slight border around it. So just remember that you want to do cutout. So this is set to Autodesk Interactive. You can also use standard. So this is, you know, where different shaders are that you can play with in Unity. There's only a couple of other things I want to show you in Maya. So let's see. So let me show you where you can access your materials. This is especially helpful if you're doing node-based. So if you go to Window, Rendering Editors, and Hypershade, you'll get this window that pops up. And it'll have all of your different materials in here. So you'll see I have my feather texture. And if I click this, I can say, I think it's this one. Maybe it's not that one. There we go. I can actually look at this node-based editing where I have these different maps and I pull them in. Again, this is more advanced. There's a lot of different tutorials on how to create different effects, but you can do things like mix different materials and things like that. Again, this is not necessarily going to transfer over to Unity. So if you do something where you start using a bunch of different effects, you will need to render it out. So maybe let me add a new material. Let's just do a Lambert and call this ramp. Let me select this and let me do a ramp. So you can, you know, change it up here. There's a lot of different settings. And so you'll see that there's a huge seam right there. So one thing that I would maybe do is just to quickly fix it. So something like that. If I were to export this out right now, it's not going to work in Unity because Maya is rendering this. And so instead, what I can do, see if I remember how to do this. We go to render Hypershade. If we select the model, I think, and shift select the ramp, I can go to Edit, Convert to File Texture, Maya software. this all looks okay. My resolution might make it not look as good because it's only 1024, but let's just do that for now. So you'll notice it was actually a little bit darker and it created a new material here. And so in this other ramp, the first one, if I go over here, I have this ramp here that I can edit. But if I go to this one that it just created and go to color, you'll notice it actually created a file. If I hit view, you'll see it saved it. It saves it into your source images. So if you're doing something like people typically use a ramp to create an eyeball, it won't work in Unity unless you do that. So again, what you need to do is select the model with the material, shift select the material in Hypershade, edit, convert to file texture. So anytime you're doing anything that's procedural. All right, so these UVs look okay. They're not great, but let's just let me pull it down just a little bit. Let me create another new material. There's a couple of other things that are cool in Maya. If you go to, is it rendering? Yeah. Okay, so if you go to rendering and come up here to texturing, you can use the 3D paint tool. You might have more luck than I do. My computer does not like this tool. Sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't. You'll notice right now, first off, I need to hold B because my brush is way too big. So I'm gonna make it much smaller. I'm even gonna, it's not letting me change it here. So I was holding B. You'll notice I have this red X right now. And it says some surfaces have no file texture assigned. So if you're using the 3D paint tool, you need to come down to the bottom and select assign edit textures. Make sure you have color. You can also use this to create bump maps and different things like that. And then you can change the size. I'll leave it as 2K. Let's just do JPEG for now. And I'll hit assign edit. I'm going to immediately click save because if you start to paint and accidentally close this, you are going to lose your work. So make sure that you hit save. Let's see, I can start to paint in here. Pick a different color. You can pick different brushes. They have some brushes in here, and I guess you could just, bring in your own. My model is probably too small. I need to make it bigger because I accidentally made it in centimeters. Let me pick a different brush, but you could start to use this, to paint directly onto your model. The level of detail, as long as you have your model that's big enough, not centimeters, the level of detail for painting is based on your UVs. So if you have bad UVs that are stretching, you'll notice when you start to paint, it will look bad. So this is really determined by your UVs. So just keep that in mind. You can do the flood paint. Let's see. Paint effects, you shouldn't use those. Those don't come across unless you convert them into 3D models. But this is just kind of a cool thing to use. And so you'll see if I go to this now and go to color, I've got something that I've started to paint on. Another thing that I can do is create a PSD network. So let's see if this makes my computer crash. I'm going to see if I can create this and open it up in Photoshop. So it's asking me, the image name. Do 2K. I do want to include the UV snapshot. I'm going to use this color value of green. So the snapshot's going to be green because I don't want to make this vase green. So it's good to have an opposite color. And then you can select which attributes you want to, paint in Photoshop. I'm just going to do color for now. I'm going to hit create. And then I had Photoshop open. Let's see if I can drag this across. And you'll see that I now have this UV snapshot where I can paint in here with these UVs. And so if I just do some sort of doodle on here, let's do another layer. And these UVs, they don't look, they're not, you can't tell where they are for this model because it's a square, but if I was doing something like the birdhouse, for example, I would be able to tell which side was which. But I just doodle on here, hit save. Let's see if it transferred across. You'll see because I selected just that layer versus the entire thing, you can actually see where I painted, which is pretty cool. You will notice that there's some weird transparency, which is based off of where I painted. It's a couple of different things. So because this has transparency and this had a little bit of transparency when I was painting it, if you want to break an attribute, you just right click over it and hit break connection, and that'll remove its connection to something. So you can see how if you had something like this one, if I brought that across, I could paint onto different pieces and update it. And it works pretty well. So one thing that's a good habit is to actually use that 3D paint tool that I just showed you and to color code things and then bring it into Photoshop to add your details. And so, I might have used the 3D paint tool to do a specific color right around where these little circles are. And then a different color up here. So I would know where on my UVs different pieces are. Let's see. So those are the main tools that I wanted to show you. Showed you how to bake. The only other thing you might be interested in is, let's see if I can find it. Is it transfer attributes? No, that's to transfer. I'm gonna have to look for it. I can't remember where it is right now, but there is a way to create normal maps or ambient occlusion maps or bake lighting in Maya if you wanted to do that. If you're baking something like lighting, you probably would rather do that in Unity because remember, it's not real time, so it might look weird if you bake the lighting. But let's say you actually used some different lights. So if I grab one of these. And I can't see it right now. So I'm going to use all lights. Maybe I got some kind of cool lighting effect and used a bunch of different lights, but you can actually do similar to how we baked in the texture with the hypershade. remember with that ramp, we can also bake lighting in. I can't remember where I go to get that though. So give me a couple minutes to look for that. Other than that, I think that's kind of all that I wanted to cover. If there are any questions.
Thanks, Kylie.
Yeah.
Yeah, so questions from everybody? Either put them in the chat and I'll relay them, or put your hands up. Is anyone there? I think there are people there.
I also know I went over a lot today, so if people need help, you know, with their individual models, I'm also happy to do that. Oh, I just found what I was looking for. Okay, so it's under rendering instead of modeling. If you go to lighting and shading and transfer maps, you can transfer something like the lighting information, or you can create a normal map from a high poly to low poly model. To do this, what you have to do is you actually have to create a copy of the model. So I would need to duplicate this. And you have to, oops. Why is it doing that? Not sure why it's doing that. You have to connect the two, the target, it'll ask you for a target mesh and a source mesh. So you're telling it which one you're taking it from, especially if you're doing like a normal map. There's a really detailed tutorial that I can also post that goes over how to bake these, because the baking's a little bit finicky. So it's usually trial and error based on the model, the resolution, and what you're trying to bake.
Last call for questions. Okay, what I'd like to encourage people to do then is, we've got an hour of class left. Maybe you can post. I think everybody's worked so hard. I have no problem sort of calling the end of the session a little earlier. Perhaps we'll go hang out on Discord in the 3D art channel if you want to ask Kylie any direct questions on Discord, if nobody has anything for here. So last questions with what we've done today. Okay, I'm going to stop recording then.
Okay.